we ought, but that we yearn, we desire to learn, to treasure this precious wisdom. And that's why we're going to spend the next hour together as even a testimony to the fact that this is absolutely on every level worthy of our attention, our time, our affection, our worship, our obedience, worshiping you and coming to understand wisdom from your hand.
Amen.
We come in humility. We come expressing what Ecclesiastes expresses. Prepared to hold our mouths, hold our tongues, and just listen.
Yes.
To listen to your word and to set aside our own assumptions. To believe that what you have said is the truth.
Amen.
That what we have thought is our own distortions. And we submit ourselves to you. We look forward to what you will minister to our hearts and what you will teach us today. We ask it in your Son's name. Amen. Okay, well, if there is nothing else, I will jump straight in. Good. Okay, great. Quick review, just so that we make sure we're all on the same page here. We're on our third session together. And so what we have talked about in the first two sessions were just an exposition or an explanation of chapter 1, the concept of vanity. Can we recover really quickly what was the concept of vanity, or what we got there? What did we conclude on that? Vanity is, and we put some of these ideas out there last time, but you can drop that in the chat. So give me some feedback there. What is vanity? What does it mean? And how is Ecclesiastes even describing this for starters? And then last time we talked about work. And so discussing the subject of work, we ended up with this conclusion. The way we said it is work is good, except when it's frustrating, right? And both of those dual realities there for work, very, very significant notions. So what we talked about here, kind of contrasting these things together. Here, work is good. Learn to enjoy your work. This is the concept of chapter 9. Whatever your hand finds to do it with your might, right? You could half do things. If you could half live life. You could sort of just do the minimum in terms of work and enjoyment and half live your entire life, if that was your choice. Much richer, much fuller to live life completely, both on the level of work and on the level of enjoyment. On the other side, because work is good and you want to learn to enjoy your work and you want to do it fully and do it well, don't let that cross over to the other extreme, where now you're kind of, your identity is wrapped up in your work. Your sense of self-worth is in your work, right? And so I am a significant person because of my work and what I accomplish. No, that's folly. Because the only reality that is abiding, the only work that is forever, is God's. Right? God's work is forever. Everything else fades with time. Okay. Well, those were our notions for the discussion to this point. And I don't know that I saw anything in the chat yet. Let's just see. Nothing. Oh, no. So hopefully we can recover something. Somebody really help me out. I mean, I would, we don't want the chat to be vacant. Somebody give me some feedback there. Just a definition of vanity or some kind of concept of what we're talking about there. And you can see, looking down, I've got here on the rest of the screen our topics for the upcoming session. So you can see everything else we're going to do coming now to our third session here. Okay. Well, still nothing on the chat. Oh. I'm sure you're working at it, putting something in there. What we came up with, frustration, futility. Thank you. What we came up with here was, I ended up with a metaphor, like vapor, yes, like blowing out condensation and trying to stuff it in a bottle. The frustration, the emptiness of trying to define meaning like that and find meaning. Life itself vaporizes, it's empty. Okay, what I'm doing tonight, injustice and oppression, takes us in a very different direction. And I'll start here with this as a graphic on two different levels, I suppose. Graphic representation of the concept of injustice and oppression. Someone else added in the chat here, vanity is catching the wind. Excellent, right on. Injustice and oppression represented like this. And the question we're asking is, why is the world so messed up? And what can anyone do about it? Why is the world so messed up, and what can be done about it? Those are the questions we're asking. The picture I've given you here is maybe one of the most dramatic pictures, that, at least for me, emotionally impacting pictures for me. And what it is, you have to know a little bit of the backstory to appreciate what's going on here. These are the people in the picture that you're seeing. These are Jews. This is during World War II. This is somewhere Hungary, Poland, that region, Middle Europe. And what's happening here is that they've all been carted out from the village. They've all been taken out into an empty area. And within probably 30 minutes to an hour, every person in this picture was dead. Within 30 minutes to an hour from when this picture was taken, all of these lives are gone. In fact, we can't be sure, but high likelihood that when this picture was taken, the shots were already being fired. And so what you're looking at here in the picture, probably the woman in the middle of the picture gets what's about to happen. She understands that her life is about to end. The baby in the middle of the picture, and this is what makes this so dramatic for me, the baby is asleep, safe, secure, resting, except he's not, because the baby will also be dead. And so what you're looking at is absolute horrifying injustice. And these people die, they're gone, and in real terms, there is no justice to this day for what happened here. Right? This has not been set right. And the crying question that comes out of that, then you end up asking, why is the world so messed up? I say it like this: how on earth do I live on a planet so incredibly broken that stuff like this happens? And life goes on, and 7 decades go by, and this is just left. They're dead. They were weak, they were powerless, nobody could do anything about it, or at least nobody did, and that's it. How on earth do I live on such a broken, profoundly broken planet? Ecclesiastes addresses or explores some of those questions. And what you see here, this long list of verses, it's a pretty significant set of data there. What you see in those verses is a lot of passages that are discussing this problem of injustice. We can't read them all, so let me just show you a couple of examples. And so I'll read through some of these. Ecclesiastes 1:15, what is crooked cannot be straight. What is lacking cannot be counted. The concept being, the world is so deeply and utterly broken, you will not be able to set it right again. You will not be able to fix the world. We'll come back to that concept. Chapter 3, verse 16, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness. In the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. And the concept here goes, even if you go to the place of greatest justice, even if you go to the courts, no court is perfect. And so even in the place where the idea as an institution, the goal of the institution itself is to bring justice. We all know that courts can be contravened. Courts can be broken. And so even in the place that is an attempt to bring about justice, you will find injustice there. That's because of this. Oppression drives the wise to madness. A bribe corrupts the heart. I mean, even in a court. In my vain life, I've seen everything. There is a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness. There's a wicked man who prolongs his life in his evil doing. You have the irony sometimes. Why do you have sometimes good people that loved God, served him with their whole lives, poured themselves out for him? They die an early death. And their neighbor, who did everything wrong, smoked, he was immoral, he never exercised, whatever. And he gets to the end of his days, and he's in his mid-90s or something, and he lives out a full life. The world is not right. It's not fair. It doesn't work the way it ought. Chapter 8, verse 10, I saw the wicked buried. They used to go in and out of the holy place, and they were praised in the city where they had done such things. Put it in modern speak. Wicked people, their whole lives, were faithful church attenders and well known as faithful church attenders. But the truth is they were wicked people. And they were praised in the city where they were wicked. In some cases, they were known as hypocrites, and people still let it go because he was influential or rich or something. This also is vanity. Because the sentence against an evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. You can do this on cosmic terms because the world itself is so broken. You've got people that are wicked and sort of seem to get away with it. And so they just keep on doing wickedness because basically their attitude is, well, nothing bad has happened yet. And so I seem to be okay so far. So far, so good is the way this goes. And that just brings me back to the first statement, the statement I started out with. What is crooked cannot be straight. What is lacking cannot be counted. That, the world, fundamentally what Solomon is saying is, the world is broken. Something ought to be done about it. This world ought to be fixed. And the reality is, it's not. It's broken. Just a pause for a question here. I just saw a note in the chat. Is it quiet on everyone's end? Are you all having trouble hearing me? I can try to speak louder, but and the only other thing I know to do, if we just make sure everyone's mic is mute, that might help. So it might be competing. So if everyone else's mic is mute, then that will help. Maybe this one be a little louder, but hopefully you can hear okay. And I can try to project a little bit more. Let me know if it's a little too quiet. Okay, so basic concept here goes, the world itself is broken. Why is it like this? And there's some concepts here, some biblical notions that ought to fit into this. I'm drawing off of that last comment, what is crooked cannot be made straight. And it's this principle, you won't be able to set aside injustice. That doesn't mean that you should stop trying. It doesn't mean that you don't care. It does mean that the problem of our world is deeper than just contemporary inequality. It's deeper than globalization. It's deeper than corporate greed. It's deeper than the modern economy. And I'm saying this because sometimes notions go around. I mean, it's good. It really is genuinely good for us to care about injustice in our world. But it's actually even more common today when I'll hear about like justice ministries or people really working hard to try to bring about justice and try to push away some of the unfairness of the world. There are a lot of ministries here in the Philippines that are poverty reduction ministries. And I'm all about trying to help people. We want to help people. The truth, though, is you're not ever going to make all of that go away. You're never going to solve the problem of poverty. And in some ways, then, it's a good effort to make. It's a good thing to try to do. But on the other hand, it is ultimately going to be futile. You won't set aside injustice. I'm just going to make a note here for myself. And that is because of this. What is the fundamental problem that stands at the core of all of it? The problem is not global inequality or injustice, globalization, corporate greed, the modern economy. The problem is people. The reason there is injustice in the world is because there are people in the world. And that isn't going away. So long as there are people, and until Jesus comes, there will be injustice. You can see that here, this notion, Jesus actually saying this, you will always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. I think what's so fascinating about this passage, Jesus, it's not that Jesus doesn't care about the poor. We have other passages where he will give instructions like, okay, sell everything you have and give it to the poor. But there's a fabulous balance that's going on here where Jesus is saying, really, what he's saying in this passage, I am higher priority than poverty reduction. That really is what he's saying. This is in the context of this perfume that was poured out. Well, this could have been sold and given to the poor. And Jesus' answer is, basically, I'm a higher priority than that. And only Jesus can rightfully say that. But it's brilliant. It's amazing. It's mind-blowing. And it is a reality that Jesus, his kingdom, his purposes are a greater reality because the poor will always be here. It's not going away. I think this helped me a little bit to interpret my world. I'll return to this idea later. This helps me interpret my world, though, because it is tempting. As a person that was only born 36 years ago and doesn't have the perspective of hundreds or thousands of years, no one does. No one ever has. Well, there have been people that lived hundreds of years, but that was a long time ago. The perspective of living hundreds of years, to be able to look back and say, for centuries or millennia, there have always been poor. There have always been injustice, and it's not going away. That kind of notion, I can't see that far back. But I think this concept does help me to recognize it's not just a problem with our world. It's not just a problem of today. And it's not a problem that any human is likely to be able to fix. Okay. That is, as I said, the problem is rooted or connected deeper. It's connected to people. And that is because one final notion that Ecclesiastes gives us, a contrast here, or a bit of a tension. Here, Ecclesiastes 7:29, it's the concept that God made man upright. And let's look at the passage, and I think it'll give us a little bit of an idea here. This alone I found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. Sought out many schemes, we don't immediately read that with understanding. But if you want to put in that, the concept of like, all we like sheep have gone astray, we have turned every one of us, each one of us has turned to his own way. So, you have sheep, they're all gathered together, okay, and then boom, what happens? They all spread in every possible direction. So in our fallenness and our depravity, every one of us has gone to the own extreme of what we in our fallenness want. We all have our own brand of fallenness. And I think that's the concept here. They have sought out many schemes, meaning God made us good, God made us right, God made us righteous and holy, innocent holiness, but we have broken it. And so I think what you're looking at here in Ecclesiastes 7:29 is, it is. This is a reference to the basic grid of theology itself. God made the world good. Our sin has broken it. God made the world good. Our sin has broken it. So if you're asking something like, why is there injustice? Ecclesiastes' answer to it, and the Bible's ultimate answer to it is, there is injustice in the world because of sin. Our sin, humanity's sin. Okay. And so now process that. How do you solve injustice in the world? And it's not going to be an economic solution. You can't solve injustice in the world by restructuring the global economy. You can only solve injustice in the world by fixing sin. And that's going to be a bit of a challenge. Right? You're not going to be able to fix sin apart from a work of grace and a powerful work of God. Okay, I'm going to pause for a second. I have some other concepts to build here, but any feedback or any questions or discussion, we're going to end up taking this in the direction kind of the bigger biblical picture, the bigger theological picture. But if there are any questions here, I'm happy to talk about those for a second. While you're maybe thinking of some questions or some interaction, and I'll look for that in the chat as we're waiting here. Let's make another point here, and this is maybe a bit not obvious. It's a little subtle, but it's an interesting concept, and it's a concept worth thinking about. Ecclesiastes talks a lot about frustration, injustice, things are not right. Why is the world like this? It should not be this way. Yes, okay, definitely Ecclesiastes type ideas. I want to argue where we look at that and we think all bad, only bad. And it is bad. It's a function, it's a result of the curse. I want to argue that even in the curse, got to be careful here, it's a subtle notion. But even in the curse, there is a function of grace. And my idea here goes, when you think the curse, you think of the fall of man, and God says to Adam, the ground is going to be cursed because of your sin. Don't just think this is God kind of like lashing out in anger. Because you did this thing, fine. I'll judge you, I'll curse you, I'm going to make your life miserable. There, deal with it. Right? It's not that belligerent. It is a curse, and it is spoken out of righteous anger. But even in his curse, even in his anger, okay, subtle idea, he is gracious. And you see that if you go back to Genesis 3. He gives the curse, and then he promises the deliverer from the curse. And I think what I've got here is something like this. Even as God curses mankind, he has in his mind the intention to redeem us. And he has, even in the way that he builds into the world, the curse, an intention to draw us back to himself. So that one of the notions here goes, as you experience a frustrating, dark, broken, unjust world, let that force you to turn your eyes up to him. Let it force you to cry out, even so, Lord, quickly come. And that's my notion here. If we lived in a world without any injustice, if we lived in a world where everything just worked really well, would we be so desperate, longing for a savior? If the world, if planet Earth was a comfortable playground where everybody got the same share, nobody struggled with frustration, sin, disease, disappointment, death, would we not be too content with the ease and simplicity of our life on the broken planet? And would we, in that, would we not fail to seek out the Savior? And so I think part of my notion here is, I think the curse is intended, the frustration, the pain, and the injustice of planet Earth is intended to make us say, this can't be all. There's got to be an answer. There has to be something coming that sets us free from all of this injustice, this pain, and this death. And that's the next point. There is hope. There is hope on two different levels. There is hope because judgment will come. Okay, now make sure, let's get these concepts in context again and have these together in our minds. What we're talking about is injustice. We're talking about oppression. We're talking about the fact that sometimes the bad guys are more powerful than the good guys. Sometimes we're talking about the fact that sometimes there is such a asymmetry of power that some people can get all the privileges and other people have none. Okay? And so one of the notions here as an answer to that is judgment. Or if I'm putting it in terms like this, when these people that have no recourse and no power are murdered coldly, and there is no justice that comes for them, Ecclesiastes answers to us, well, yes, judgment will come. You just have to wait long enough. It's not here yet, but it will come. And you can see all the passages here. I'm not going to read them all. We'll look at a small sampling of the passages. But it is a big idea in Ecclesiastes. I'll actually skip the first just for time, but let's look at chapter 3, verse 17. I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked. You see this in chapter 8, verse 11. Sentence against an evil man is not executed speedily. Okay, but he comes to the conclusion, verse 12, yet I know, though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, it will eventually be well with those who fear God. And eventually it will not be well with the wicked because he does not fear God. In other words, right now it doesn't work this way. Right now, obeying and loving and following God does not guarantee that things will work better for you. Eventually, things will work the way they're supposed to, eventually. And jumping down a little further, let's look at chapter 9, verse 7. Here, go eat your bread with joy, drink your wine, for God has already approved what you do. And so that's giving you this sense of, okay, God is measuring, God is watching. And that's significant because 11, verse 9, know for all these things, God will bring you into judgment. So judgment is coming eventually. And the book actually ends. Ecclesiastes 12:14 is, of course, the last verse of the book. The last verse of the book. Fear God, keep his commandments, because God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. And by secret things, we could say like things maybe that you personally hide, or, you might do and you think nobody knows. Let's think broader than that. Let's think things like this, things that were never settled, right? It happened, those people were killed, we don't know their names, we don't know how to make it right. God will bring every secret thing that happened into judgment, and he will set it right. Judgment will come. So for right now, I have no answers for this. And this becomes a big apologetic issue, right? How can we talk about a good God who's all-powerful if evil exists? And we look at this kind of thing and we say, I have no answer. I can give you no simple, easy answers, even theological answers that solve the problem of evil. But somewhere in here, the fundamental answer to the problem of evil goes, God will eventually bring the people who did this into judgment. and he will eventually make it right. Not now. And so for right now, I'm in a kind of a holding pattern. I'm waiting. It's the walk of faith for now, but there will be judgment. It will come. Well, let's process this for just a little bit, because there's some complexity here. I'll skip down. I'm going to skip one point here. Let's go here. Think for a second about how complicated it is to actually bring about true justice. And here's where I take a bit of issue against something like, say something like justice ministry. It's good to try to help people. It's good to try to alleviate human suffering and sorrow. Good idea. Okay, but a justice ministry that would say something like, our mission is to restore justice on earth. And I look at that and say, you're biting off a little bit more than you can chew, because it's a bit more complicated than that, right? If we imagine something like, what do I do to make, let's say that, let's make all incomes equal. Everybody gets the same pay. Okay, if you think about economics a little bit, that is absolute havoc. It would destroy the global economy in no time, right? It's a worthless idea. It's a horrible idea. If we want to say something like, okay, the people who did this very evil thing, okay, great. All those guys ought to be executed for the evil that they did. Okay, well, I'll tell you how this worked. When they tried to do the trials and they tried to bring these people to justice, the argument that basically everybody made, from the bottom all the way up to the top. Here, this is Hermann Goering, he was one of the major engineers of these executions. When they bring these people in, his argument, and the argument of many others, was, I was just following orders. The system itself required me to do this. And if I hadn't done it, they would have executed me. So I was just following orders, but I had no power of my own to choose whether or not I would kill these people. So it's not my fault. It's the guy above me, okay? But it goes all the way to the top, and ultimately the guy, Adolf Hitler, had already committed suicide. So what you discovered in the process of trying to bring about justice for these people is that these people make it so complicated that you don't know how to bring about justice. You don't know how to punish them. And let's face it, if this guy is responsible for the death of hundreds of thousands or millions, what are you going to do? Kill him thousands of times? What are you going to do? Execute him 1,000,000 times? I mean, you can't execute the guy, bring him back to life, execute him again. I wouldn't be in favor of torturing him to death or something. So how do you bring about justice to a guy like this who has killed millions? And the answer is, you can't. And he was actually, if you know his story, he was actually condemned to be executed. He was going to be hung. And the night before, somehow, he got a poison pill in his cell, and he swallowed it, and he committed suicide. And so he never was hung. He never was brought to justice. Another irony of his life, and another reason that he's a fitting example of the complexity of justice, is that the latter part, he was the head of the, I don't know how to say it well, Luftwaffe, I don't know, the German Air Force. So he was the head over that department, and very, very powerful, one of the most powerful people in the early part of the war. Well, when the German Air Force is decimated in the latter part of the war, he loses his influence. And so what he did for the last part of the war, he was interested in art and other things. And so he actually spent most of his time collecting the treasures, the art treasures and other things that were taken from Jews. Okay, and so when they would be captured and interrogated, he would make sure that their art treasures were hid away and preserved. Okay. Well, the irony even to the present is that we still don't know how to return the art treasures back to the original owners, because the original owners, of course, obviously are most of them dead. Their children or their grandchildren are still around, but which child do you give it to? Which grandchild gets this, very, very precious piece of this Picasso or something? Who do you give it to? And the point of all that is to say, even to the present 2019, we have still not brought about justice for what happened in the 1940s. We still haven't, and we never will. We never will actually bring about justice because we can't. We're too weak. And that highlights then this notion again. How do you bring about justice? And the answer is, if it's you and I we're talking about, you cannot. Even if you were granted right now somehow complete power, governmental power to do whatever you want, and if somehow with that power you had the ability, or you were incorruptible, which is a major question, you still could not bring about complete justice. Okay, so what do we do, and how do we solve the problem? I'm going to look at Isaiah 11, and let's talk about that for a few minutes. Isaiah 11, process the notion this way. And you're looking at here a messianic passage. So let's look at this. Just to support what I'm arguing, there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. That language gets picked up later. In Revelation, it gets picked up in Jeremiah too. Jeremiah as well as Revelation, both places connected to Jesus. Okay, so this passage is about Jesus, the Messiah. The Spirit of the Lord will rest upon him. Wisdom, understanding, counsel, might, knowledge, the fear of the Lord. His delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. And now let's look at what the result then of the Messiah's reign is. Verse 3. He will not judge by what his eyes see. He will not decide disputes by what his ears hear. With righteousness, he will judge the poor. He will decide with equity, fairness, for the meek of the earth, which meek of the earth sounds a little bit like the Beatitudes. Blessed are the meek. Right. He shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth. With the breath of his lips, he shall kill the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt of his waist. Faithfulness, the belt of his loins. And let me just break down these ideas a bit. Part of the problem we have with justice is that even the judge is still corruptible, right? Ecclesiastes idea, even in the place of justice, even in the place of righteousness, I saw injustice. The judges are incorruptible. So you could say something like, well, if they made me the uncontestable czar of the world, then I would bring about justice, right? I would do what's right and bring about equity. And I think the biblical answer there goes, you have a bit too much confidence in yourself. I'll put it for myself. I would have a bit too much confidence in myself to think that I could have that kind of power and stay true, because you wouldn't. Power corrupts. But part of the concept I have that's so rich here, verse 5, righteousness will be the belt of his waist, faithfulness the belt of his loins. He will have all power over planet Earth. He will be the king of the planet, and he will stay true. He will not be corrupted. We had an interesting interaction in one of the classes here at BJNBC talking about a one world government. And one of the students made a great point, say, well, what about, is there nothing good about a one world government? And the answer is, there is good about the one world government as long as you can choose who the king is. If the king is Jesus, I'm in favor of a one world government, but only him, right? Because anybody else would be corrupted by that kind of power. Okay, we have that notion, but let's look at what that looks like. How will he judge, or how will he bring about righteousness? And the answer is verse 3. He will not judge by what his eyes see. He will not decide disputes by what his ears hear. And the notion here goes, every judge in the history of the world has made their decisions based on the evidence that they were given, right? Okay, so the way we even have a process for this, right? We have an adversarial process. You have the defense, and you have the prosecution. And so the two representatives, and they're going back and forth against each other. And we do an adversarial process, and we have a notion of innocent until proven guilty. All of these things are legal foundations on the assumption that sometimes the courts get it wrong. And so we build these systems in so that through the adversarial process and a jury and a judge and everything like that, we're doing our best. Basically, we're saying we can't do it perfectly, but let's try to make it as good as we can. Okay. But what about this? How about a judge that has absolute uncontestable power, and he just says, verdict, done, over. And there's no contesting, there's no appeal, there's no system of appeals courts, none of it. He just gives his verdict and it's over. And the irony of that, no human being should have that power. That's too much, right? Except for Jesus. Because the irony here is he doesn't even have to hear the prosecution and the defense. They don't even need to tell him what happened. They don't need to bring in evidence. They don't need to show recordings or DNA or anything. There's none of that. He doesn't need it. It's not necessary. He just knows what happens. Without hearing and without seeing, he knows, because he knows all things. And so what would it be then to have a judge who just says, because I'm omniscient, I know exactly the truth of what happened in this case, and so I settle for this party. Done, settled, over. Case closed. That's it. Okay, this is the extraordinary aspect of his reign. The result of which, now if we jump down to verse 6, is that the wolf shall dwell with the lamb. The leopard shall lie down with the young goat, the calf, the lion, the fatted calf together. A little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze. Their young shall lie down together. The lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the cobra. The weaned child shall put his hand on the adder's fin. Okay, I won't do this for time. But highlight the animals. Wolf, lamb, shepherd, calf, lion, goat, cow, bear. Okay, you can highlight all the animals across there. He's not talking about people here. He's not talking about society changes. He's talking about the animals are different. That's how radical this change is. The animals will be changed. Nature itself will be transformed. The world itself will work in different ways. His power to bring about justice is it's so total and it's so uncontested that he not only changes the human space, but he even brings about justice and rectitude in nature among the animals. That's the extent of his power to transform. Because of this, verse 9, they shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And I think what you get putting some of these pieces together is justice, the nature of justice itself is such a thing. You can't half do justice. In other words, you can't, it's not like you can say, well, okay, well, we made the world 80% just. That's enough. It's not enough because it's still not just. 20% is still significant. Okay, well, now the world is 90% just. Yeah, but that 10% really hurts, and it's probably going to spread. You can't half do justice. The only way to really do justice is to do it all the way. And the only way to do it all the way is Jesus. So a very defining foundation of thinking about justice itself is that Jesus himself has to establish it, and he will. It's eschatological, and it's Christological. It's centered on him, and it's fulfilled in the future. It's really, really big. Big concept, big notion. Okay, I will pause there for a second. If there's any feedback or comments, happy to do a discussion of any particular points. There's a couple, maybe two other points to make here are concepts to explore and more than we can cover in our time. But if you have concepts or discussions you want to have, drop those in the chat. So what we've done here so far, processing this, we started out with the first basic question. Why is the world so messed up? What can anybody do about it? And where we ended up with answers, or let's say the beginnings of answers to that. Why is the world so messed up? Well, there is hope. And the hope is that judgment will come. And the judgment that will come ultimately is God bringing about righteousness in the person of his son. But let's do two more layers to this. And here's a layer that we need to think about. One of our notions goes, we want justice. The world is not right. The world, it should not be this way. We want justice, we say. And we do. I'm not questioning that. We do genuinely want justice. Okay, fact. But pause here for a second and recognize, we say we want justice, okay, but do we want justice that works like this? The kind of justice we're talking about would also apply to us. That it's not just justice, those guys are bad, let's fix those guys. The problem is, think of it deeply, the problem is not just those guys. The problem is also me. I am part of the injustice. I am part of the injustice to the extent that I sin. Every time I sin, I am part of what is wrong with the world, what is broken in the world. And so one of the notions we've got to be honest with ourselves about is, we say we want justice for the world so long as the standards don't apply to us. We want justice for the world. What we tend to mean, we would be satisfied with a world where murder would go away. We would be satisfied with a world where child trafficking, sex trafficking would vanish, and where people would get a fair compensation for the level of their effort and time and so forth. We would be satisfied with a world like that. Recognize, though, Jesus is not satisfied with so low a standard. But Jesus would call into account every sin. And so the justice that we ought to talk about then is a complete justice that includes, let's go to the extreme, if I really get what I deserve, right now I'm in hell. If I really get what I deserve is eternal punishment for my treachery against Almighty God. And so to really talk about justice, the world as it ought to be, or things being done justly, I have to go one more layer. And that layer is this, that Jesus himself entered into our suffering. Jesus himself entered in and experienced what it feels like to live in an unjust world. There's a really profound notion here. I look around me in my world and I see things and they are not as they ought to be, and that frustrates me. If I say something like, the problem is globalism or the modern economy, wrong. The problem is people. And the significance of that notion is a theological concept as it connects to this. Jesus entered into authentic human suffering. Even though there was not yet globalization and there was not a modern economy, Jesus entered into authentic human suffering. And this concept goes all the way across the biblical story. I want you to pay attention to the notion of justice as you read these verses. And my argument is going, I'll develop this idea in just a bit. My argument is going that justice is not just a detail in the story, but that justice is central to the biblical story. 1 Peter 3:18, Christ also suffered once for sins. My sins. Okay, I can put my name there. Christ also suffered once for Joel Arnold's sins. Put your name there. Say it. Own it. Jesus suffered for Joel Arnold's sin. The righteous, the just, for the unrighteous, which is me. That he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. Okay, and so pay attention to the notions of justice. The righteous, the just one, for the unrighteous. Try this on for justice. I deserve to suffer forever. Jesus deserved perfection in the presence of God forever, and he switched. And so injustice, that injustice, if you want to say it that way, the world not being as it ought to have been. Do I really, really want the world to be as it ought to have been? Do I really want justice? And the answer is, well, here is the supreme marvel. God chose to not give me what I deserve. And in his place, the righteous one, Jesus Christ, suffered, died. 2 Corinthians 5:21, for our sake, he, God, made Jesus to be sin. Jesus becomes guilty. Even though he has no sin, the sinless one becomes guilty, so that we might become, we the sinless ones, the sinful ones, might become the righteousness. It's not just righteousness as a notion, not just righteousness on a human level, but the righteousness of God. Divine righteousness in the person of his Son becomes mine. And my sin is laid on him. Okay, there's a picture of justice. It did not happen to me according to what ought to have happened. Because in my place, Jesus carried my sin, and I went free. Isaiah 53:5, he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the righteous punishment, the chastisement, that brought us peace. With his wounds we are healed. Every stroke, every moment of agony, all of the suffering, not just at the cross, not just at Gethsemane, but just the sheer frustration of being human from the day he was born to the day he died, all of that suffering was an expression of his love for me. That he entered into my suffering, carried it all, and used the sharpness of Isaiah's words That suffering brought me peace. With his wounds, with his suffering, I'm healed. It's through his sorrow, through his pain, through the horror and the agony of his suffering that I am made clean and that I am healed. It is through the horror that he experiences that I find joy and I am set free. Though all we like sheep, verse 6, have gone astray, we have turned every one to his own way. The Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Romans 3:26, it was to show his righteousness, his justice at the present time, so that he might be, just look at the depth of justice words, that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. To show his justice at the present time, so that he will be just, righteous, and be able to declare people righteous. And if I was going to summarize all of this data, all of these verses together into a single statement, I would say this. Recognize that justice stands at the heart of the biblical story. Justice is not just a side detail. We struggle with the problem of evil as though it's something against Christianity. And it is a struggle, a real struggle that I don't want to dismiss. But recognize Christianity is not embarrassed or blind to the problem of evil. Actually, the problem of evil, the problem of justice and injustice is right at the center, the core, the very essence of the Christian story works like this. The just dies for the unjust. The one with no sin becomes sin, so that the perpetrators can become righteous. And so God engineers the story so that he is both just and the justifier of guilty people. Guilty people are declared righteous, and God is not unjust in doing that. He can justly say that guilty people are righteous. And he does that by exhausting his righteous wrath in Jesus. And that points us then to this eschatological hope that we talked about earlier, that the end of the story also has the ring of justice to it. Only when Jesus reigns as king will the world itself have true justice. The biblical story has this whole issue at its very core. Very big, profound notions that Scripture itself confronts us with. That takes me down to here, the last, and that is a question: what to do in the meantime. Okay, so I have a notion of justice and injustice, rooting these concepts all the way back to the gospel and to the story of my salvation in the person of Jesus. Okay, but as of, what's the day? March 28th, 2019, I still have to live. And so I still need to get up tomorrow, March 29th, 2019. And I still need to exist. March 30th, injustice will still be in the world. I'm waiting for Jesus' return. And so biblically speaking, my heart cries out, "Oh Lord, how long? Right? When will he come?" So these notions are there, but I still need to live in the world. How do I do it? And I think Ecclesiastes, together with the whole biblical story, is giving us some really helpful perspectives for processing these challenges. We actually have a much firmer foundation for helping people in injustice and how we view oppression. We don't attack injustice because we actually think that we can permanently solve it. We don't go into the ministry of alleviating human suffering naively thinking that if all of God's people would just work hard enough at it, we can make this go away. It will not go away until Jesus comes. Fact. Now, that sounds pretty pessimistic. I don't think it has to be. The result of this is when we can't solve the problem of injustice, don't be discouraged. Don't be jaded. In other words, if someone comes in and sells you on an idea, hey, if we as a body of God's people will just pour enough resources, effort, and love into this and that situation, we can fix it all. You're setting people up to be discouraged, because 5 years later, 10 years later, guess what they're going to do? They're going to go into this situation, they're going to look around, and they're going to realize, like, we made about that much progress. And that's nice, but we didn't solve the problem. You can't, unless there's a gospel work here. But if, on the other hand, we'll tell people from the front end, hey, injustice, it's always going to be here. Let's try to help. but don't have high hopes that you're going to solve poverty. You're not going to make poverty in the world go away. If we will look at it realistically, I think we're not left so discouraged when it doesn't happen. Number two, we can accurately, as Christians, we can accurately identify what is wrong with the world. The problem is not capitalism, it's not globalism. And so a lot of the NGOs and the efforts that are made they're gonna connect the problem in like that. It's gonna go something like, we, by the exercise of enough human creativity, and if we just set our minds to it, we can solve these problems. And we come back and say, oh no, seriously? No. Humanity is 6,000 years old, and we've always been selfish, and it's always been rough. So we can solve this problem, another problem will pop up. Right? Our problem is not capitalism or globalism, but biblically speaking, we know this. The problem is sin. The problem is the curse. Okay? And that means then that we can help people better because we care about them. Something that rings a little hollow about something like solving global poverty is the problem you're trying to solve is a thing, an abstract kind of a concept floating up there in the sky. We're going to solve poverty. Okay? And more realistic is, I'm going to help this guy that's in front of me today. This is the guy I'm going to try to help. Okay, that's I think a more humble, more realistic, and I think a more gospel-centric reality. We talk to people not just to solve their problem. Like, I'm a doctor, I'm going to come in and I have my anti-poverty shot. I'll give you an anti-poverty shot. Now, see, poverty went away. But we talk to them as people and we recognize their more basic need as humans. You're a person made in the image of God, like me, broken by the curse, like me, struggling with sin, like me, able to be saved by the power of Jesus' grace and his work on the cross, like me. So let me tell you about this gospel. And what we're offering them is something more beautiful, more basic, and more life-changing than just poverty reduction. There is a deeply apologetic component to this part of the story. And here's something I've used a lot. I'm thinking here of a very specific interchange that I had. It's with a person very nearby here, and he has a Buddhist background. And so he talks a lot about global inequality. The world is not working right, these kinds of notions, which I agree with, absolutely. And so in these conversations here, what I've ended up turning this to, as I discuss things with him, I'll say to him, hey, yeah, the world is really bad. The world is really broken, and it's really not fair. What do you think the solution is? How do you think we can solve any of that? And then I've ended up going to Isaiah 11 type of passages. I actually have talked to him about Ecclesiastes. And I think you can do something here in witnessing that it gives you a little bit of an entrance in to talk about the bigger gospel story. Okay. A concept that I'll want to return here if we can, maybe in a future lecture. It goes like this. Why is the world so good, so beautiful? Human life itself is a rich, beautiful, fulfilling privilege. It's a wonderful thing. So in so many ways, the world is wonderful. Life is wonderful. Life is good. It's a beautiful privilege, except when it's not. And so I can give you examples of, I saw a video pop up on my Facebook feed recently, something like, watch this video and it will restore your faith in humanity. Okay, I can read lots of stories of human beings working together to do incredible things because they cared about another person. And so that's rich and that's fulfilling and makes me feel better about humanity. Until then, I go back and I look at another picture like the one I started out with. And part of the logic goes, how can humanity and the world itself be at the same time so incredibly beautiful, good, rich, selfless, and so incredibly broken, unjust, awful? How can life be good and such a horror all at the same time? And the biblical story explains that better than any other. The biblical story and the biblical answer on that is, well, God made the world good. He put lots of his goodness and his grace all over it. He made good food. He made beautiful air, beautiful nature, plants, animals, and mountains, and the ocean, and all of this beauty. And then our sin broke it. That's the biblical story. And the biblical story explains how our world can be simultaneously really good and really bad, better than any other story can. There is no other option that explains it so well. And the last thing I'll say as far as what we to do in the meantime is one other piece of advice that Ecclesiastes gives us in chapter 5, verse 19. Everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them, and to accept his lot, and to rejoice in his toil, this is the gift of God. There are a lot of other passages we could look at to kind of develop this notion. There's another one that always makes me laugh that we will, maybe we looked at it last week. He says, I saw that all skill and work is because of a man's jealousy of his neighbor. Remember that? And so I think one of the notions that floats around in Ecclesiastes is people are driven by jealousy and to try to be, they see this other guy achieve this, so they've got to have it too. Facebook might make this worse because everybody puts up their pictures of their wonderful vacations. Then you judge your vacation on whether it was as good as theirs. Right? And every time someone, accomplishes some new thing, they got a new degree, they wrote a book, they were accepted into some great university, they got a new job, they bought a new house, they have a new car, then they're going to post a picture of it. You're going to see it, and then you're going to look at your house, and it doesn't look as good anymore. And one of the pieces of advice that Ecclesiastes gives us is this: accept your lot, accept what God has given you, and rejoice in your labor, and that's the gift of God. And this is profoundly real and practical. That to process life thinking about what I don't have is just going to frustrate me. Stop and think about the blessings that God has put into your hand and just accept where he's put you. Okay, so that guy has whatever, this job that, he makes 3 times as much as me or something. He probably has 3 times the stress. So he probably deserves to get paid 3 times more because, I don't know, he spent 10 years in school and then now he has to deal with the stress all the time of a high pressure job. So, just enjoy where you're at. Do what you're going to do it well, and enjoy it and be satisfied. Life's going to go a whole lot better if you're just satisfied with what you're doing and do a good job. And I think that's the last piece of this. Not that we always accept injustice. I'm going to back off of that. Don't accept injustice, but don't let it ruin you. If something unfair happens to you, don't let that turn you bitter. It hurts. It's hard. Okay? Step forward and live, because you can't change it anyway. And wait for Jesus' return. Ultimately, Jesus as the only one who can set all this right. Well, my time here is 8:59, so I suppose technically I could say I left time for questions, but it would have to be a question that came in the next 30 seconds or so. If you have a question, pop it in there. But what we've got coming up now, next time we'll be talking about chapter 3. This is To Everything There Is a Season. And so we're going to talk about balance. The idea that wisdom, the hard questions don't always have simple answers. And it's not always, in this situation, do that, simple, done. That actually wisdom works like this. Sometimes it's a judgment call. And you just have to figure out how to make a good judgment call. We'll also talk next week about chapter 7. And this is that challenging passage that says, do not be over righteous and do not be overly wicked. And so if that passage has bothered you, I'm sure it has, then next week we'll talk about it. And in the process, I think we'll come away with some lessons about the nature of wisdom itself. So I will look forward to seeing you a week from today. And as you have questions or comments or anything you're wondering about, shoot me a note. Always happy to hear from you.
All right, Jacob had asked me to end the session. So anybody else has a question? If not, I think it's 9 p.m. So thank you very much, Dr. Anna, for this very enlightening session. I think we live in a world filled with injustice, but we are reminded that we have hope, and that we are reminded we are no better, actually. If God had judged us, then I think we will not be here. So thank you very much for reminding us all these precious lessons. Anybody else, any question, you can type to everyone. Otherwise, I think we will end here. We'll see you again next week.
Very good. Thank you very much. I
Okay.
always look forward to this each week. Thank you.